Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Autonomous Health Podcast. This is your host, Anmol Madan, and alongside me for this episode are two incredible data scientists who worked at the intersection of healthcare and machine learning and data science for many years now, RJ Ellis and Robbie Capps. And together we're going to talk about continuous glucose monitors and the whole set of opportunities that they unlock when it comes to not just metabolic disease and chronic conditions, but even everyday health. So welcome RJ and welcome Robbie to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yep, same.
So RJ and Robbie, you guys have obviously a really fascinating background. And I was wondering if you could just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here and what you've been doing over the last several years.
Yeah, thanks. I'll kick it off. So my journey into data science came relatively late. I spent most of my career in academia doing a PhD and a first postdoc and a second postdoc because one is never enough, and found myself working in the chronic condition space in San Francisco at a variety of companies. And over time became more and more plugged in with interesting processing of biosignals. And one of those is CGM, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about it today. So overall, it's been a fascinating journey. I wouldn't have changed a thing. And the big joy of that is getting to work with really talented folks like Robbie, who was on my team in a previous life at Teladoc, and Anmol, you as well. Really exciting to work with great folks accomplishing really interesting stuff.
It's very cool, RJ. Robbie, do you want to chime in and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, piggybacking on RJ's, so I immediately out of my PhD in neuroscience, I came to work with RJ at Livongo Health in San Francisco as well now. And before that, I've had a multitude of different types of data science-oriented projects that I've worked on really for some time now. During my PhD, my work was mostly focused on developing computational neurophysiology models and simulations that leverage dynamical systems. And then going over to Teladoc was really my first foray into kind of more industrial data science per se. And now I am the founder of PFund Digital Health, working on developing tools for people with diabetes.
Right, cool. And RJ, you may have glossed over this part, but you actually came from the world of music to healthcare. Is that fair? Is that a fair statement?
I did. It's, I keep my microphone and all of my instruments at close by just in case there's ever an emergency need for that. Most of my initial career was on the cognitive psychology and the psychophysiology of how humans process music. There is some degree of interplay between how those signals work and the kinds of things that, say, happen in hospitals with alerts and notifications, and we're always overwhelmed by a huge volume of auditory signal. How do we extract meaning from that? I think there's interplay between how it works for the management of chronic conditions as well as for folks that spend their life thinking about music.
Yeah, so there's some parallels between the different fields, and I think a lot of creative perspectives shared across them as well. And so, obviously, with both of you and the vast experience you have working with healthcare problems, we can talk about a lot of things. And what I thought we'd spend time on today for this episode was really go deeper into continuous glucose monitoring. And I think it's fair to say there's been a fair bit of a revolution here in the last couple of decades, and the ability to collect and measure blood glucose at scale across broad swaths of our population is something that's really emerged. And stepping away from the finger pricking sort of blood test to a continuous signal in this space that's measured every few minutes unlocks a number of new opportunities and unlocks a number of new kinds of capabilities for companies. So maybe we start there. And RJ, if you want to jump in and even give us some context on what are continuous glucose monitors and whether have you seen the growth in applications in the recent past?
Sure, yeah. Maybe I'll take one step back first, which is to talk a bit more broadly about different classes of health signals that many folks may be familiar with and some of the benefits and disadvantages of those. So let's talk about three broad health signals: measuring your weight, measuring your blood pressure, and measuring your blood glucose. So measuring your weight is relatively straightforward. You step on a scale and it spits out a number. But it's sort of a pretty non-specific number. In fact, even in clinical trials where the target is weight loss, folks are asked to maybe weigh in at most once a day, maybe more like once a week would be the right cadence of measurements. When we're talking about blood pressure, relatively easy to measure. However, there is lots of room for measurement error. If the cuff is too big or too small, that can lead to measurement accuracy issues. It's also a bit challenging to put a cuff on and measure it at the same time. And the technology is not really great for doing multiple automated measurements per day as you go about your day. Now, for blood glucose, this is, of course, essential for folks living with diabetes, particularly those who use insulin, where they need to take a needle, prick their finger, draw some blood, look at a number, and change their course of action afterwards. But drawing blood is painful and time-consuming. So this is really where continuous glucose monitoring really comes in. Now, there's one subtle difference, which is CGM measures glucose not in the blood, but in the interstitial fluid. So the sensor actually sits usually on the abdomen. There's a very small little wire that goes under the skin. Once that sensor is on, that sensor lasts for up to 7 to 10 days, extending soon into more like a 2-week time frame. And it records a reading once every 5 minutes. So just for data scientists in the room to think about that for a moment, the volume of data that you get from even a single sensor wear of CGM is hundreds of times more data than you might get from even a very willing and compliant patient living with diabetes. So that really opens up a whole interesting realm of what sort of things could we do with that signal. And we'll for sure dive into that more later on. There's a pretty large opportunity size for folks that can use CGM. The American Diabetes Association notes that there are 10 million Americans that use insulin to manage their diabetes and could directly benefit from a CGM. And a very recent announcement from Dexcom, who's one of the major large manufacturers of CGM, just recently noting that they have designed a CGM system that is explicitly designed for the 25 million or so Americans that live with type 2 diabetes that don't require insulin. So we're talking tens of millions of patients that are directly relevant for CGM, as well as a whole host of companies that are designing systems and marketing to individuals that may not have a clinical diagnosis of diabetes, but are just interested in general in better understanding their glucose and how it relates to their diet and their exercise. So pretty big market opportunity as the field continues to grow.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think the point that you made, which is really worth underscoring, is we went from measuring blood glucose with this big step and doing it very infrequently to collecting a signal about blood glucose on a very regular sort of predictable scale, and the number of applications that unlocks and the kinds of behaviors it unlocks, whether it's diet or lifestyle changes or even just insights about a person. I think we're going to go deeper into some of those questions as well. Robbie, any thoughts you want to add there? I know you've been thinking about CGM data for quite a while over different roles, and it's been a personal passion for you as well.
Yeah, definitely. There's of course a lot to think about there, and I certainly don't want to start this off by taking up all of the time, because that may well be what ends up happening at some point. But I will say that I think that
may not be a bad thing, but continue, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's important to keep in mind, I guess, that despite these important advancements in the sensor technology, that we need to keep in mind that what is the actual practical value of the data that we're receiving? What is the advantage that it actually provides over having these kind of intermittent values that we get from just a finger prick? And how can it actually be used to help actually treat each individual's specific personal health maladies?
Yeah, some really new opportunities there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, obviously this new signal, lots of questions to talk about when we think of the challenges of working with CGM data, but also the new kinds of analyses and models that you can build with CGM data in the context of whether it's diabetes or whether it's just broader consumer wellness. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about an example of how should people think about modeling with CGM data, and any thoughts on sort of the biosignal approach. And given our past discussions on this topic, I think we probably will talk a lot about how that compares to other machine learning modeling approaches in other physiological signals. So maybe if you want to dig into that a little bit, Robbie.
Yeah, sure. So at its simplest, this is one of the oldest issues actually in fields like data science, even dating back to just the concept of quantitative analysis, which is the difference between linear and nonlinear signals or patterns, what have you. And something that we see pretty regularly with CGM in particular, something that's pretty different actually from a lot of the other types of signals that we've historically developed mathematical techniques for, that we've gotten used to dealing with, things like the power grid and even actually some weather patterns. CGM is highly nonlinear. It makes it very difficult. You have to be very careful in applying specific techniques, analytical techniques. You have to be aware of exactly what the assumptions are for any particular technique that you might be utilizing. And then that's compounded further by the fact that diabetes is an incredibly complex disease, and any kind of metabolic disease by definition actually is extremely complex in the time domain. And because of that, we actually really need right now more than ever to be focused on developing brand new techniques, mathematical techniques, quantitative techniques, even ability to communicate. All of those things need to be working together in order for us to make headway and actually utilize this new data type. So I'll cede for now and see. I mean, does anybody else, RJ, have comment on that?
It's interesting, Robbie. I mean, oftentimes I think we as data scientists, for better or for worse, partly just how we grapple the universe is to say, okay, I know it's a giant mountain that I'm trying to climb, but I'm just going to focus on this one little piece of it. And for a first approximation, maybe that's fine. And I think the danger comes from when we mistake looking at one tiny little piece of the puzzle for the entire puzzle. I remember some joke about, the way you study icebergs in a lab is you put a piece of ice in a glass and you watch it melt and everything is measured. But that's not actually how an iceberg works, right? And I think there's a danger in trying to overly componentize and say, oh, I'm only looking at glucose or I'm only looking at weight. And indeed, the human body is a pretty remarkable system and machine. And by only looking at one piece of that without relevant context within the body, let alone things happening outside of the body, behaviors and other things that we do, we're only really getting part of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think there is a viewpoint which I come from, which is perhaps a little bit complementary, which is for a lot of machine learning use cases in our society, the way data science and machine learning models attack the problem may be fundamentally different from the way humans attack the problem. And, an example of, the models that do object recognition work on a very different basis than perhaps the way the human eye works, right? Or our systems that do speech synthesis or understand speech work very differently from the way that we understand speech or the way we speak as humans and the physiological mechanisms there. So I think there's and it's sort of interesting to see how machine learning and AI models end up understanding the problem from a generative lens, sort of at a core level, but they end up doing it in a way that's different than how humans would actually solve it, or the biological processes happening in humans that would solve it. And I think that's probably a discussion that we've had in the context of CGMs and how we design systems to predict what's going to happen with blood glucose or take action on blood glucose data over the years.
There's also, I think, another interesting point, which is as we are, say, a given organization is starting a brand new foray into, we have all of this new data, what should we do with it? To only look at it, or to look at it through a set of parallel lenses rather than a unified lens, creates some challenges. If you only have data scientists looking at the problem, or only have clinicians that don't know how to write code looking at the problem, you will end up with some very different solutions. And I think that ties back to sort of that unified versus component approach as well. Or rather, for folks that live in data science, we may be familiar with the term of an ensemble model. I think that idea of an ensemble also applies to how we arrange human beings to tackle problems as well. And it takes certainly more effort to get subject matter expertise from a clinician and a data scientist and endocrinologist and maybe a patient point of view as well. But if we can do that, maybe we'll get one step closer to something that not only is correct in terms of the inferences that it's making, but useful by the folks that it's actually being designed for.
Yeah. And RJ, on that note, do you want to take a minute and maybe you want to underscore or highlight any of this? Are there particular applications that you think are really unlocked with CGM data that have been proven out, that are either in sort of widespread adoption today, or that you expect will be in widespread adoption in the near future?
It's interesting, actually. I'll put Robbie on the spot a little bit about this, because I know that in many of our past conversations, we've talked about the utility of CGM in the context of a closed loop insulin system. And if you go to conferences, and I have and other folks have as well, you'll see all these booths about these systems. And the idea of having in a single system something that measures your glucose and can actually connect to the system that's dosing the insulin and have that feedback loop, now you really have the potential to not set it and forget it from the patient point of view, but certainly reduce the chance of missed opportunities to really very finely calibrate what needs to happen to make the body work well. But Robbie, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this too.
Yeah, I have probably even too many different little anecdotes to relate. But yeah, I mean, thanks for the tee up, because there's a lot. So one thing I'll start with actually is kind of a little story from my time, RJ, when we were on the same team. In looking at many different CGM traces, I was relating recently to somebody realizing that probably the only thing that I have done every single day for the last 2 or 3 years has been look at a CGM trace. And still in my mind, there's one trace in particular, some CGM data from an anonymous source, that is the most incredible glucose data that I have ever seen. And it's just very perfectly, better than any healthy person actually that I've seen, very perfectly going between about 80 mgdl and 125 3 times right in the middle of the day at exactly breakfast, lunch, and dinner time, and otherwise completely stable. So we're talking about like the definition beyond actually the definition that I had seen in textbooks for healthy. It's like there's no way to do that as a human being. And so relating back to what you're talking about, RJ, systems like the one that you're mentioning, where you have a closed loop. Another word for this, of course, is artificial pancreas. In general, is kind of the idea is that we're essentially replicating the utility of the human pancreas, right? Since that's what's lost in metabolic disorders like diabetes. And so very likely, I suspect that this individual was probably utilizing such a device. Either that, or I have no idea how else it would be possible. But the point is that the technology really has come a very long way. But I will also add that this is a technology that can still improve, actually. There's still more that we could actually get out of this, and namely, it is the ability to understand exactly why somebody needs some particular interventions and what they can do about it, even if they can't afford, say, the top of the line artificial pancreas device.
Right. This is very interesting. And so this closed loop system, tell us where this is in terms of prevalence. Has the FDA kind of gone off and said these are expected in the market sometime in the near future, or whether we on the horizon for these to become really common? Or Robbie, do you think that there are fundamental challenges, either technology challenges, hardware challenges, that are still steps before we see that happen in the world?
That's a really excellent question, actually. So it's exactly the way I would frame it. There really are a number of different facts to consider when thinking about the future of this type of technology. Right now, the most prevalent type of system that I know of is actually an open source artificial pancreas system where people can literally cobble together various different instruments, including CGMs and insulin pumps, And there's a GitHub repo actually for this open source project, and that right now, as far as I know, is by far the most prevalent thing that's out there, and it's not really on the market, and of course there's lots of liability to think about in such a thing. So obviously regulation is right around the corner in terms of trying to actually get our heads around what type of policy makes sense from, say, the FDA's point of view. There are a little bit more directions out there in terms of implementation on the market. There's some devices I know in Australia right now that have a small community around them that essentially do some of these functions. But long term, kind of thinking about the potential risks of something like this, if we imagine that perhaps such a device were to become extremely prevalent in use, and even to think about it as being an everyday sort of thing for somebody with metabolic issues, I think that, and we were actually talking about this earlier before we started recording, the issue also of drugs and related kind of interventions, it's a very similar kind of situation where we really do need to consider a holistic perspective. We need to be able to keep in mind all at once that there are genetic, environmental, and actually even just like other universal physiological factors, like the interaction between the gut and the liver and, say, the rest of the body, the pancreas. And this introduces so many different sources of dynamics, and it really introduces the possibility of creating chaos in the body long term. And so I think it's a very good way to think about this right now, that even though it would be very easy to think of this as a quick fix or kind of a magic bullet, the reality is that when you're dealing with a system that's as complex as the human body, there truly is no magic bullet, and we need to keep that in mind so we don't do more harm than good.
Yeah, and just Robbie, to connect the dots for people listening to this podcast, what you're referring to is some of the drugs that have seen widespread adoption in the last year or so, Ozempic being one of them, but there's another that's in trials with Lilly as well that are helping with appetite suppression, weight loss, and so there's been a lot of excitement, or I guess adoption of those. And so you're referring to the link between those medications or those drugs and blood glucose, and the way we think of even interpreting data from CGMs and the kinds of models we may want to build in that context. Is that the right framing for what you, just to connect the dots on what you said?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And I'll clarify a little bit further. So quite literally, some of the molecules that these drugs, especially the one that you're talking about, this experimental drug right now that's for appetite suppression in particular, there are numerous different pathways that this is going to interact with. It's actually some of the same pathways in the gut that metformin as well as sulfonylureas are acting on. And they do have really potentially risky long-term effects. And so, and of course, like I said, it does depend highly on the individual and their lifestyle, et cetera. And so, yeah, that is exactly right. Just like with these types of drugs, as great as they may be in some contexts, such a system like this artificial pancreas or closed loop insulin pump system that we're talking about really does come with similar risks potentially that we need to be able to suss out.
And how should people building products or services or using CGM data in their products think about designing for these risks? I mean, any advice for people who are using such sort of biosignal data and driving perhaps interventions or new capabilities?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that I see in general, as even as just a data scientist or just in any kind of critical decision making process, you really need to keep in mind that there is a difference between the abstraction and the way of thinking about a problem that is most convenient. There's a difference between that and what is actually occurring in physical reality. And even though it may be easy to do things like implement neural networks or machine learning based methods that can do really incredible things, the problem ultimately is that if we don't know the source of the variability that we're characterizing, which is really the case with a lot of these really large deep learning or machine learning based models that operate on a population level. Those models work so well because the people have worked very hard to understand the specific data that they're bringing in. So if our listeners potentially have heard of supervised learning as a paradigm, a way of developing models. Supervised learning algorithms really are the ones that end up getting the most traction for these types of applications. And the reason is because you know exactly what the input is and you know exactly what the output is. And that's all well and good. But if every single person in your cohort, your entire population that you're looking at, is not undergoing a series of genetic, clinical, etc. measurements to understand every single detail of exactly who they are and how they behave really moment to moment, then what you're actually creating is, even if it can learn something like how to quote unquote perform the optimal quote unquote action to improve their health, even if it's capable of that, if we don't understand exactly what is happening in their bodies on an individual level, that is where we end up with potential problems. We end up inviting problems where we are now, essentially telling thousands, potentially millions, or even billions of people what to do without really knowing exactly what's happening. And so, yeah, in short, my advice would be to focus on that, to focus on what specifically in terms of physiology is actually occurring when you make these types of decisions for people, health decisions.
Yeah. And RJ, I know you probably want to share a lot on this topic as well. And then the other place where I would love to hear your thoughts is continuing the conversation of how should people building products and applications think about CGM data as a signal or blood glucose as a signal in designing products and capabilities around that. And not just for the diabetes population where CGMs are prescribed today, but also with the movement to use CGM data as a general wellness tool and understanding blood glucose patterns across just broad populations, people who are not diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. So maybe walk us through some of your thinking there and advice there for people building products and companies.
So, Anmol, I wonder if I can answer that question, but first, let me take a step back and talk about a different hypothetical example. So let's say our company is trying to build the best food logger out there. So normally with a food logger, you write down what meal you had, you talk about the size of the meal, the time of day, etc. Let's say we had a great engineering team and they built a food logger where all you have to do is take a photo of your meal. It can x-ray through all the things on your plate, know where there's mayonnaise, all of the calories, all of the macronutrients. Say, amazing, we can get all this information just from a photo. We release it out, we give it to folks. But now, of course, folks always have to take a photo every time they eat, and then they can learn how many calories they have left. And then one step further, even if that was exactly right, is that really teaching someone how to think more healthily about their food? When they're hungry, does that magic calorie counter tell them why they're hungry? Well, probably not without some additional signal. And I wonder if there's a parallel to how companies that are either currently using CGM or thinking about using CGM in the context of a larger behavioral health offering might also think about this, which is the signal's super interesting, as we talked about before. It's super dense and rich, as we talked about before. But that trace of glucose data is only part of the picture. It doesn't by itself tell you if and when you had a meal. Maybe we can build an algorithm for that. Or if and when you had a medication.
So, RJ, can I unpack something you're saying there? Because I think it's really important. And I think, Robbie, you also went down this path, which is it sounds like you're saying there's two views of the world. And depending on the use case and the problem we're solving, the way we think of modeling health signals generally, but CGM data in particular, we pick one of the two. And so there are use cases where you want to build the most accurate models, but you don't care about the underlying causal mechanism or explaining the causal mechanism. And so in the machine learning world, we talk about explainability as the sort of discussion area. And I think it sounds like what both of you are saying is for most real world applications of CGM data, understanding what the causal relationships are between the actions a person took or other things that are happening in their body, as RJ you were describing earlier, is actually really important. And that's where the rich applications are going to come from. and there's less of a need or there's less of a use case for just these black box, deep learning models and throwing them on CGM data. It sounds like both of you are coming at that, but from different examples.
I think that's fair. Maybe let me see if I can synthesize that too. There is real value in having a model, a system that does some magic under the hood and always spits out a right answer. Now, what we do with that right answer, I think that's really where it matters. If we have a model that can exactly tell you when your glucose is about to go very, very low or very, very high, you can drink a glass of orange juice if you need to have your glucose go up, or sit down if that may help. So those momentary decisions can be helpful. But that model may not tell you why is it trending in a certain way, or what is the underlying cause of that, unless those are the features that we have properly encoded as it goes in. And I think that takes us back to that, why it's valuable to have that ensemble approach. But that's one of my hot takes from it. But Robbie, what about you?
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a really great way to think about it. And something it reminds me of actually is an issue that my mom had been having recently. She recently got a Dexcom CGM, and she is an interesting case because she exercises like a fiend. She's really into doing 5Ks, 10Ks, and she's doing some kind of exercise at the gym pretty much every single day. And so she was really surprised to realize that she was having, some glucose issues. And so, fundamentally, she's actually kind of the perfect person to be thinking about the advantages that might be provided by some more kind of nuanced analysis and better data collection practices, because it's all about understanding exactly the reasoning behind these different treatment options. See, because, exercise might be something that is actually even contraindicated for certain people. Something she realized, for example, is that every single time that she would go on a run, that was when she was actually hitting these glucose highs. Essentially, it's because of adrenaline. But if you didn't have kind of that extra physiological understanding, then you just wouldn't know. And so you'd keep exercising, you'd thinking that it's something that's helping, but ultimately actually doing yourself harm.
Yeah. So some real insight there. This has been an incredible discussion. Any parting thoughts, Robbie and RJ, that you want to share to people who are either passionate about CGM data or anything actually on what is going to happen when CGMs, which it looks like are coming for the broader consumer market, not just people with diabetes? And any parting thoughts on any of those topics?
I think from my side, huge opportunity and also huge responsibility for those of us that are the experts in handling large amounts of data, processing it, synthesizing it, and making it actionable. The availability of CGM, the fact that there are companies where if you went online right now, you could buy your own, demo it, try it out. Robbie also raised the very valid point that there's a very active community of individuals living with diabetes that are very motivated to be writing code and writing modules and releasing packages. So there's a lot out there for folks in the data science community to download sample data, try their hand at understanding this a bit more. So I think it's an interesting call to action for those of us to really take this signal and make it the most useful and valuable it can be.
I'll echo that and also quickly plug. There are many different potential solutions out there for doing such a thing, for getting a better handle on your glucose data. But the one that I would recommend is pFun Glucose, which you can find out more about that at pFun, that's PFUN.ONE, pFun.one.
Never let an opportunity go for a good a good plug. That's a great one, Robbie. And probably our first one this series, but this is awesome. Gentlemen, it's such a treat to have a chance to talk to both of you on this forum. Thank you again for carving out the time and continue to be a big supporter of all the amazing work you guys are doing. So once again, this is your host, Anmol Matan from the Autonomous Health Podcast, saying goodbye with our friends RJ Ellis and Robbie Capps.
Bye. Thanks.
We will try to release our episodes on a regular cadence, and you should be able to find them online as well as in your favorite podcast app. So once again, thanks again. This is Anmol, and have a good rest of your day.